continue with our ecology unit, and we are going to start lesson number 6, cycles through an ecosystem. The note taker is 1 page. It goes over the 3 cycles that you're responsible for, and also we will continue exploring how energy flows and nutrients cycle. So let's get started with our lesson number 6. So our first PowerPoint shows us how energy flows through an ecosystem, right? Energy flows here from a plant, an herbivore, carnivore, another carnivore, and another carnivore, because these organisms are acquiring the energy from the food that they eat. Okay, so we see that energy is flowing up here. We learned from the last lesson that only about 10% of that energy is passed on from one organism to the next, right? Because a lot of it gets lost. It's the cost of living. Today, we're going to see what happens to the nutrients. So what happens to these organisms when they die, right? So what's going to happen to this carnivore? What's going to happen to this herbivore? Well, when all of these organisms die, they become nutrients. And all of these nutrients have to get there one way or another, and that happens through a process called decomposition. And decomposition is only possible because of organisms known as decomposers. So decomposers are organisms that return nutrients to the soil after an organism dies. So an example of a decomposer would be fungi or bacteria. So here we see all of these organisms here breaking down into nutrients by decomposers. So here we see a recycling process, right? Nothing gets lost. Everything gets recycled. So this is a little bit different to what we saw before when energy was able to flow, right? Energy would flow, but some of it would get lost. But nutrients are completely recyclable. So this is an important process. So let's see how nutrients cycle around through decomposers. So here we see that in the soil you have a lot of inorganic elements, and we see that those inorganic elements can be taken up by producers. These could be autotrophs or plants. And then we know that the consumers are the ones that eat the producers. So we see that the nutrients from the soil can be taken up by the producers all the way to the consumers. And then when the consumers and the producers die, they get decomposed and then they come back to the soil. So this is a total recyclable process. Okay? Everything gets recycled. All the nutrients get recycled. But energy, on the other hand, what did we see happening with energy? We saw that energy just flows, right? So we know that energy comes from the sun. It hits the producers, the autotrophs or the plants, and then the herbivores or the primary consumers feed on those producers. And we know that secondary consumers or carnivores feed on those primary consumers. So we see a transfer of energy here, but we also see a loss of energy, right? So we said that about 90% of that energy flowing gets lost into the environment, and about 10% of energy gets passed on from one organism to the next. Nutrients, on the other hand, let's recap this again, are found in the soil, right? And when the consumers die, producers can also die, the decomposers take those nutrients and they take them back to the soil and they get recycled. And then the producers or the plants get a hold of those nutrients again, and the process repeats itself. So here we see ecosystem inputs. The inputs can be energy or nutrients. We see that the sun provides a constant input of energy. Energy flows, though, through our planet, but nutrients cycle. So again, a very important concept in ecology. Energy flows, but nutrients cycle. So don't forget the laws of physics. that matter cannot be created nor destroyed, so that makes sense that all of these nutrients that are matter are actually recycling, right? They're not being created, they're not being destroyed. Nutrients can only cycle. Energy flows through an ecosystem. Nutrients cycle. Energy flows. All right, so speaking of the nutrient cycles, you are responsible for describing the processes of 3 different cycles. So the most common examples of such matter and nutrients include carbon, nitrogen, and water. So in your note taker, you are going to write down some of the definitions of the different processes found within these cycles. So let's start with the water cycle. And for the water cycle, you're supposed to define evaporation, precipitation, condensation, and transpiration. So I will go through this, but also there is a very cute song, and there is a link to the song here. It's a YouTube song, and you can listen to this. It's a song to the tune of "She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain." So I'm not going to sing it for you, but make sure you look at the YouTube video. It'll help you remember the different parts of the water cycle. All right, so let's look at evaporation. What is evaporation? So evaporation is when water does what? Water from the bodies of water of our planet. Water is turned from a liquid to a gas. That is evaporation. Water is transformed from a liquid state to a gaseous state. That's evaporation. And then what happens in precipitation? So precipitation is a fancy name for rain. So in precipitation, we see that gaseous water, or water in the form of gas, turns to liquid, and then that liquid falls down. So that is known as rain or precipitation. So the conversion of gaseous water or gas to liquid water. Okay. And then we have condensation. Even though condensation, the process is not written here, but we see clouds. And we know that condensation is also what happens after water in a liquid state forms into a gas, or after water evaporates. So when liquid water evaporates into a gas, that gas can condense into clouds. So it can condense into a gaseous form of clouds. So that is condensation. And then we have transpiration. And in transpiration, it's when water that is found within a plant, that water is released by the stoma, or these pores found in the leaves of plants. So transpiration is think of it kind of like sweating, right? It's kind of like perspiration. So transpiration is kind of like plants sweating. So you take the water inside the plants and you release that water through the leaves. That is known as transpiration. Okay, now let's look at the carbon cycle. So for the carbon cycle, you are responsible for 4 different processes: respiration, photosynthesis, combustion, and decomposition. So let's look at those. And here's a definition of all the different processes. So I'm going to go back and forth and show you where these processes are happening. So first, let's start with respiration. Respiration is when CO2, or carbon dioxide, is released from animals into air. So organisms, animals, plants too, go through a process known as respiration. So as we exhale, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's why here we see plants and animals, through the process of respiration, are putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that is respiration. What about photosynthesis? That's when carbon dioxide gets trapped by plants and turned into oxygen. So now we're going backwards. Now this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gets trapped by the plants. plants undergo a process known as photosynthesis and convert that CO2 into oxygen that we need. Combustion is when organic carbon in the form of fossil fuels, gas, oil, and coal are burned and turned into CO2. So in industry and homes, in order to provide energy for us, for humans, we burn carbon dioxide. We burn gases and fuels known as fossil fuels. And the burning of these fossil fuels results in a process known as combustion of these fuels, and that lets out a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And in a couple of lessons, we're going to learn what are the repercussions of putting too much CO2 into the atmosphere. Is that good? Is that bad? What happens when there is too much CO2 in the atmosphere? And then finally, decomposition. This is when decomposers break down dead material or organic carbon from plants and other organisms, and they release CO2 into the air, soil, and water. So here we see a lot of these animals, of course, die and they decompose, and there's a lot of dead material here. And then what happens to all that dead material? The decomposers break it down, and then some of that CO2 gets released into the air, into the soil, and sometimes go back into the water here. Okay, so all of this dead materials here get decomposed even further, and they can end up back in the water. They can end up as nutrients for plants and for animals. So that is the last process of decomposition. Okay, now let's look at the nitrogen cycle. The main components of the nitrogen cycle are nitrogen fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, and denitrification. So here we see a picture of some of the some of the main components of the nitrogen cycle. And here we see how in red some of these processes are caused by human activities, and then some of them are caused by natural activities. So let's start with atmospheric nitrogen here. So this is nitrogen that's up in the air. So nitrogen in the air is in the form of a diatomic molecule. It looks like this, N2. Well, this molecule in the air is sometimes taken up by nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. And this nitrogen-fixing bacteria can be found in the roots of plants. So what happens is that this nitrogen gets taken up by these producers, and then the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that's found in root nodules and also in the soil take that atmospheric nitrogen and they break it up into simpler forms known as ammonium and ammonia. So these are forms that can actually then be broken down even further and then taken up by other organisms. So what else could happen? Well, this ammonium and ammonia undergoes another process called nitrification. So in this process here of nitrification, it's a process carried out by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and it transforms soil and ammonia into nitrates, which plants can incorporate into their own tissue. So this ammonia gets broken down even further into nitrites, and then it gets broken down even further into nitrates, right? And then this is a form that can be assimilated by the producers, by plants, okay? So assimilation means nitrates and ammonia resulting from nitrogen fixation are assimilated into the tissue of plants. Okay. So what's another process that could happen? Well, another process is known as, let's go to ammonification. So what happens in ammonification? The remains of all living things and their waste product are decomposed by microorganisms, which yields ammonia and ammonium. So here we see dead plants and animals. We see the decomposers break them down, and they turn all of the nitrogen in these dead animals and plants into ammonium which is an ion, or ammonia, they can then undergo the nitrification process so that it can get assimilated into plants. Okay? And finally, we have denitrification, and in denitrification, the loss or removal of nitrogen or nitrogen compounds specifically happens by the reduction of nitrates or nitrates, commonly by bacteria, as in soil, that usually results in the escape of nitrogen into the air. So we have the reduction of these nitrates by bacteria, and what ends up happening is that nitrogen can then be put back into the air as atmospheric nitrogen. Okay. A lot of these dead animals and plants can also be used as fossil fuels. So, for example, we know that peat is just a whole bunch of plants that have been compressed and through millions of years, and then that can turn into a fossil fuel. So that's another way to put the nitrogen back into the air. Okay. We also know that volcanoes, when they erupt, or the smoke coming out of volcanoes, that also contains nitrogen. That nitrogen can get mixed in the rain, and then that can come back down again. And we also know that lightning also plays an important role in the nitrogen cycle, because lightning can also help break down the atmospheric nitrogen. It splits this N2 molecule, and then that makes it easier for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the ground to then continue fixing the nitrogen into ammonium and ammonia. Okay, so here are all the definitions of the processes that happen in the nitrogen cycle. So make sure that you write down the definitions in your note taker, and that is it for today.